Welcome back. In this video, we're going to introduce our study of Daniel 5 by setting the stage by considering the literary and historical context. Now, like the other stories in Daniel 1 to 6, Daniel 5 is a court tale. But it's not just a court tale. In fact, like Daniel 1, 2, and 4, Daniel 5 is specifically a tale of court contest. And you may recall that Tremper Longman explained that basically a tale of court contest describes a situation where, for instance, the king has a problem that he needs to have solved. And so he asks the wise men, including Daniel, to resolve the problem. And Daniel and the wise men engage in a kind of competition to fix the king's problem. And Daniel, as the one who resolves the problem, then receives an appropriate reward. Now, this describes Daniel 1, 2, 4, and 5. And I point out this genre detail because I think the tale of court contest serves the purpose of highlighting the vast superiority of Daniel's God over the false gods of the Babylonians. So as we read the story, that's what we should be looking out for, how it demonstrates that Yahweh is superior to the gods of Babylon. Now, the next literary context detail I want to refresh your memory on is that, as we pointed out in our video at the start of Daniel chapter 4, Daniel 2 to 7 has what we call a chiastic structure. And if you look on the slide, you will see that on the outside, chapters 2 to 7 are framed by these two stories in which there are visions or dreams of these four earthly kingdoms that are destroyed by God's kingdom that will last forever. And then next inside the frame are two parallel stories about Jews who are being delivered from some deathly kind of peril. But in the middle, at the center, in the place of emphasis, there are these two stories, Daniel 4 and 5, about these two arrogant kings who are humbled by God, which demonstrates that God is sovereign. Now, right there in the center where we have these two stories, there is also a contrast in these two parallel stories in Daniel 4 and 5. There's a contrast first between a good, ideal king, that's Nebuchadnezzar, and a bad king, who we will meet in chapter 5, Belshazzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is the ideal Gentile king because he's proud, but he repents and humbles himself, and he is restored. But Belshazzar is a bad Gentile king because he does not repent, he does not humble himself, and he is destroyed, and he loses the kingdom. The point of all this is that God is sovereign, and that the response of the Gentile kings to him will affect what happens to them and their kingdoms in the end. Now, Nebuchadnezzar as the Babylonian king features in all of the court tales from Daniel 1 to 4. He's in fact the king who takes Daniel into exile after defeating Jerusalem and making the Judean king Jehoiakim his vassal. Now, under Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the stories of Daniel 1 to 4 take place. And from the slide, you can see first in Daniel 1, Daniel is taken to Babylon. And then in Daniel 2, he has the problem of solving Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And then in Daniel 3, we have the story of Daniel's three friends in the fiery furnace. And then in Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar is humbled. Now, in Daniel 5, for the first time, we have the mention of another king than Nebuchadnezzar, and that's Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is effectively the last of the Babylonian kings, and we meet him on the last night of the Babylonian Empire. So from the events of chapter 4, when we get to chapter 5, we're moving to the very end of the Babylonian Empire. And in chapter 5, we will see Belshazzar has a feast in which there is some writing on the wall. But at the very end, we're told that Babylon is captured by the Medes and the Persians. Now, notice that Nebuchadnezzar dies in 562 BC, and he ruled for 43 years. And so Daniel has been in exile in Babylon this entire time. after Nebuchadnezzar dies, in a 6-year period, he's succeeded by 3 other kings who reign until 556 BC, when a king called Nabonidus takes the throne. It's to note that these are not peaceful transitions by continuous lineal descent, but succession by political intrigue, including assassinations and depositions and mysterious disappearances. Now, in 556, Nabonidus is installed as king. And as you can see from the slide, he's not a biological descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. And around 550 BC, his son Belshazzar becomes a co-king, or the term is co-regent. And it is during Belshazzar's co-regency that the events of Daniel 5 take place and Babylon is captured by Cyrus the Great. The events of Daniel 5 and the fall of Babylon therefore take place some 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death and the end of his reign. And so that means that if Daniel was 15 when he was taken to Babylon in 605 BC, 66 years would have now passed. And Daniel, the Daniel of Daniel 5, would be about 81 years old in 539 BC when Babylon falls and the events of Daniel 5 take place. Now, let's see if we can narrow down, as we delve a little bit more now into the history, if we can telescope our discussion to the Babylonian kings that are actually mentioned in Daniel. Now, in the 19th century, some scholars questioned whether Belshazzar actually existed. And that's because he was never mentioned by any of the Greek historians. And on this basis, they questioned the authenticity and historicity of the book of Daniel, and they suggested that Daniel was not written during the time of the Babylonians and Persian empires, as it seems to contend it was written, but much later, during the time of the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC, which would be about 300 years after the Babylonian and Persian transition. And these scholars say this because the writer of the book of Daniel writes long after the Babylonian and Persian kings. And they suggest that he was not familiar with the history and the facts of the time of the Babylonians and Persians, and so he made some mistakes with the historical facts. However, in the second half of the 19th century, scholars actually discovered how to decipher Akkadian. That's the ancient language of the Babylonians. And they deciphered how to read it in the cuneiform script. That's a kind of wedge-shaped script in which Akkadian was written. And they discovered that Belshazzar's name was actually mentioned in some of these cuneiform scripts, and he was referred to as Nabonidus' eldest son and the crown prince. And amongst these cuneiform scripts, it was discovered that over 30 different documents mention Belshazzar's name. It was also discovered amongst these documents that Belshazzar served as acting king or co-regent for the last 10 years of his father's Nabonidus' 17-year reign, when Nabonidus had left Babylon to conquer another city called Tema, about 500 miles south of Babylon. Really, Tema was an oasis in the Arabian desert, the part of the world that we today call Saudi Arabia. Nabonidus made Tema his royal residence and lived there for 10 years, not visiting Babylon. And whilst in Tema, he promoted the worship of his patron deity, the moon god Sin. Now, it appears that Nabonidus chose to live in Tema and away from Babylon because he was in a dispute with the priests of Marduk, who were opposed to his promoting the cult of this rival moon god Sin. Marduk was the patron deity of Babylon, the chief of the Babylonian pantheon. Now, during this time, Belshazzar, as crown prince, was de facto king in Babylon. And so the Jews in Babylon would have regarded him as such. Accordingly, they would have referred to him as king in Daniel. Belshazzar is in fact treated as co-king with his father by some contemporary local documents dating to the 12th year of Nabonidus' reign. And these documents record unusual oaths sworn in the name of both men, including the statement that Nabonidus, the father, had entrusted the kingship into Belshazzar's hands in his absence. Well, that background will help us to make sense of Belshazzar's curious promise in Daniel 5:16 that Daniel will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom if Daniel can read the writing on the wall. In Daniel 5:16, the king says to Daniel, "Now I've heard that you're able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you'll be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck," and here are the key words, "and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." The point is that Daniel is offered not the first or the second highest spot in ruling the kingdom, but the third, because Nabonidus, who was away, was the highest ruler. He was a king. And Belshazzar, his son, was the second highest ruler. And so the next highest position on offer was the position of third highest ruler. Nabonidus is king, Belshazzar co-king. And so the highest spot available is third highest ruler, and that's what gets offered to Daniel. So that little detail helps us to make sense of exactly what is said to Daniel in Daniel 5:16. Now, Daniel 5:1 begins with the statement that King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. So the story begins by telling us that King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Daniel 5:30-31 also tells us that on the very night of this banquet, Belshazzar was slain and the Babylonian kingdom was taken over by the Medes. Now this leads us to ask, what was the historical background for this banquet? What were the historical circumstances under which the banquet was being held? As we will see, the historical record suggests that a banquet or feast was in fact held on the very night that the city of Babylon was conquered and the Babylonian kingdom was taken over by the Medes and the Persians. Now, from extra-biblical sources, we know that Babylon fell in October 539 to the combined armies of the Medes and the Persians under Cyrus the Great. And so the feast that is recorded in Daniel 5 takes place in October of 539. Now, during the years leading up to this climactic event, Cyrus had been leading his armies against the Babylonian Empire. And Nabonidus returned to Babylon around 540 BC when Cyrus was preparing to make war against Babylon. And Nabonidus led the Babylonian armies against Cyrus, while Belshazzar apparently continued to rule over Babylon itself. Now, Nabonidus attempted to lead an assault against the Medo-Persian forces of Cyrus, but he was defeated and had to flee to Borsippa. So if you look at the top left of the slide, you will see this is an extract from the Nabonidus Chronicle. It says that the month Tashritu, Cyrus fought the army of Akkad at Opis on the Tigris. On the 15th day, Sippar, that's a city, was seized without battle. Nabonidus fled. On the 16th day, Gobryas, governor of Gutium, and the army of Cyrus entered Babylon without battle. Now, Tashritu is basically equivalent to the month of October, so that's telling us that this happened in October of 539. So what we have is a situation where Cyrus defeats the Babylonians at a city called Opis. That's the first battle there towards the top of the slide. And Opis is basically modern Baghdad. It's in the north on the river Tigris, about 50 miles north of Babylon. And Cyrus defeats the Babylonians there and took that city. Now, a few days later, it says the 15th day, which really is about October 10, 539, Cyrus took another city called Sippar. That's the second battle there on the slide. And he takes that without opposition. Now, we are also told that Nabonidus flees after that battle to a city called Borsippa. And you see that little arrow pointing off to Borsippa. Now, the Persians, led by a general of Cyrus called Ugbaru or Gobrias, he's also the governor of Gutium. These Persians ultimately took Babylon on October 12, 539. That's the third battle there on the map. But since the Babylonians, like the Israelites, begin the new day at sunset, which is the night of the feast on October 11, that was already considered the 16th of Teshrit, which would be October 12 on their count. Now, Cyrus, the fourth event that you see there on the map, enters Babylon on October 29, 539. The Nabonidus Chronicle also records that after fleeing to Borsippa, Nabonidus later surrenders. And so the Nabonidus Chronicle records that Cyrus had already conquered the neighboring cities to Babylon, nearby, Sippar and Opis. And so the advance of his armies had brought him within only a few kilometers of Babylon itself. And his forces enter Babylon on October 12. And we're told that by history that the city fell that very night and Belshazzar, well, the king, was killed. So Babylon is surrounded at the time of this feast that we read off in Daniel 5. And Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, had abandoned the capital and basically left him to face the enemy. This is the context of Daniel chapter 5. Well, as Paul Tanner puts it, thus the feast of Daniel 5 was no ordinary feast. The Babylonian Empire was in the process of crumbling. Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, had attempted to lead an assault against the Medo-Persian forces of Cyrus, but had been defeated and had to flee to Borsippa. At the time of this feast, Babylon was surrounded by the troops of Ugbaru, a general under Cyrus. Perhaps Belshazzar and the citizens of Babylon felt secure behind the massive walls of the city, having enough food and provisions outlast a siege of several years. Yahweh God, however, had other plans for Belshazzar and Babylon. So Belshazzar was holding down the fort back in Babylon, aware of his father's defeat and his dire circumstances. And Paul Tanner suggests that perhaps he thought, well, the walls will hold. But as we will see, as the story unfolds, the Persians basically come under the wall. And that very night, he would lose his life and the kingdom would pass to the Persians. So that's, I think, a good introduction to set us up for the events of Daniel 5. In our next video, we're going to study Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 to 4, and see how this story begins. I hope that you will join us then.